Good morning. Today we will read Leviticus 4 through 7. We started on Saturday, the first three chapters of Leviticus dealing with sacrifices, the burnt offerings for different aspects of sin and praising God. And, some of them were for, there was the burnt offerings of animals, the grain offerings, and then there were offerings of thanks, of praise, of, well-being. And chapters 4 and 5 talk about sin offerings. Chapter 6 and 5 and then part of 6 talk about guilt offerings. And then the end of chapter 6 and 7 talk about more of the instructions to priests and things of how they are to do these offerings. I guess I need to remind you, tomorrow morning I'm going to be on early. It'll be, you'll be able to find it whenever you look, of course, but I'm going to be on early tomorrow morning. But looking at these chapters today, the sin offering is a sacrifice of repentance for sin. And you remember, as we've begun the church year, we've on Sunday mornings, we had, the stories of John the Baptist coming with this baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And so this, this baptism of John, really changed things from this book of Leviticus, because here, it's the chapter 4 and 5, deal with the offerings for sin and the repentance that is to come, from that offering. I mean, and, the offerings were, a bull or a goat or a ram or, just, different things that way that were specified. And verse 3 of chapter 4 says, if it is the anointed priest who sins, thus bringing a guilt offering on the people, he shall, God is saying, not only the people sin, but the priests sin as well. Just a reminder, the priest, pastor or whatever, no different than any other person that there is. But, it was, he made sure that everybody realized that everybody sinned. And to back up just into verse 2, he says, whenever anyone sins unintentionally in any of the Lord's commandments, things not to be done. And, so it's, it's sins known and unknown, that we confess that way as well. And, but it's, the instructions. And here again, this is, God speaking to Moses when he's up on the mountain. And so Moses, has to remember all of this so that then he can be able to tell the priests and tell the people when he comes back down off the mountain. And, it's just, remembering all these laws and the rituals and the rules and the differences in them. And that's, even for me, I don't study this hard enough so that I can tell you, well, this is what you have to do for that, I just, but it's dealing with sin offerings. And then verse 13 says, if the whole congregation of Israel unintentionally sins and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, this is one of those things that kind of puzzles me. How could everybody sin unintentionally? And it's, somebody's pulling the wool over their eyes. Somebody's leading them astray and they all fall for this, whatever it is, and it's, so someone is coming in with some untruths and they're speaking this untruth in a way that, hey, that sounds like a good idea, But anyway, there's definite offerings for unintentional sins compared to intentional sins. And, an intentional sin is, it's something that you do knowingly, that way. It's, it's just like, if you're going to go and steal something, it's wrong before you do it, and, there are unintentional things that we do that way, but, there are certain things that, to do them is very intentional. Verse 22 of chapter 4 again says, when a ruler sins, doing unintentionally any one of all of the things, of the commandments of the Lord, and has occurred guilt, and so it's, the priest and the people and the rulers, and, it's no one is exempt, no one is above the law. And that's, something that sometimes people forget. But it's, so in verse 24, for this ruler's sin, the priest shall lay his hand on the head of the goat. It'll be, and slaughtered in the spot where the burnt offering is. And, and it just talks about all of how you do it. And again, it's, all the fat shall be turned into smoke, like the fat of the sacrifice of well-being. The fat was God's, and that was not to be eaten or consumed by the people. Verse 27, if any of the ordinary people sin amongst you. So, here we had priests and the community and the rulers, and now, the ordinary people, but it's, and the rules are the same for everybody, about sinning, but the difference comes in what the burnt offering might be. And, but yet, the burnt offerings are all very similar as well. Verse 32 of chapter 4, if an offering you bring as a sin offering is a sheep, you shall bring a female without any blemish. On Saturday we talked about, it was mostly, a bull or the male, but although the male or female could be for some, but here now this specifies a female. And then, and it tells you, you take some of the blood and you put it on the altar and you do this and that and all of that, everything else going on. To remove all the fat, as the fat is removed from the sacrifice of the well-being, and the priest shall turn it into smoke and the offering to the Lord, and the priest will make atonement on your behalf. And so it's, it's kind of the idea, the image of coming to the priest with your confession of sin, and the priest, coming to God, and this is what they were doing. The ordinary person or the ruler or the congregation, didn't do the sacrifices. That was the high priest's job. Chapter 5, if any of you have a sin that you have heard about publicly, and you're able to testify about it, and you don't speak up, it's one of those things that, you don't get complicit in covering up on something, and then it goes on, and in verse 7, if you can't afford a sheep, you shall bring to the Lord a penalty, of 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and so there are allowances made for how wealthy a person is, how the person's well-being, his the property that he owns, but also a little bit for the bigness of the sin, kind of sort of that way. Verse 11 says, if you can't afford 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, you shall bring as your sin offering that you have committed 1/10 of an ephah of the choice flour. So there's, there are allowances. God is making allowances. And, he still does that today. He makes allowances for us. That's for sure. And so that, chapter 5 continues to talk about sin and guilt offerings. And the last verse of chapter 5 says, it is a guilt offering. You have incurred guilt before the Lord. And at chapter 6, the first 7 verses continue those sin offerings, cases or things of doing damage or harming, another person. And then starting in verse 8, we start seeing the instructions to the priests, so the rest of chapter 6 and chapter 7 are instructions to the priests as to how they do all of these sacrifices. It says in here, the fire on the altar of sacrifice is never to go out. That is, that burns all the time. And so that, when there is an offering to be made, a sacrifice to be made, the fire doesn't have to be started that way. And then we get into some holiness things in verse 7 as well, what they call them, like verse 19 says, flesh that touches anything unclean shall not be eaten, it shall be burned up, and so there's this, this differentiation between clean and unclean that starts to come in all of these things. And for me, it's just way too much to keep track of. But God was setting the parameters, giving instructions, and offering or giving them a way to, to sacrifice for their sins, to come to God saying, I'm sorry. So these sacrifices were there, a sacrifice of repentance, a sacrifice of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And John's baptism, I mentioned, was a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And, so God continues to find ways to come to us as his people, to lead and guide us and encourage us in